Excellent. There's our cue. So I do want to thank you. Again, this is the monthly webinar that the New England FAASTeam we tend to do. We cover all sorts of subjects, maintenance, operations, aerodynamics a little bit tonight. You name it, if it's there to help you improve in your safety, we try to hit upon them. And we try to give you some practical experience with it. Today, we are going to be talking about what is your angle and rate climbs in an aircraft. Talk a lot about VX, VY, and the differences that come across from them. You may have seen a little bit, I'm just going to cover it quickly, but New England FAASTeam. In Bradley, we have Dan Carter on the operations side, Rob Leonard, there's their contact information. We'll have it again at the end of this evening. The two operations folks in the Portland, Maine office and the Boston office, John Wood in the back there, I up in the front. There is our contact information. And in the past year, or maybe now actually with COVID, it all blends together, is joining John in Portland, Maine is John Bell, who is on the maintenance side. I do know John is out on a little bit longer family vacation here with the recent holidays, so he is not joining us this evening, but he is available, especially for the maintenance type stuff going on. And what we're going to hit upon tonight is we'll talk about VY, VX, common V speeds that you may know for flying your airplane. We'll talk a little bit about cruise climb. What we're going to spend most of the time on tonight is what are those things that do affect your takeoff performance and your climb performance more so than anything else is what we will focus on. We'll talk about some of the performance you might encounter in the real world. What are the things that your manual doesn't tell you about, but that you do end up encountering and flying your aircraft? We'll mention one or two things on multi-engine, but guess what? Climbing in a multi-engine aircraft is a whole nother kit and caboodle. We could do, just a webinar on that. It actually probably more than just a single webinar on that. So we'll touch base on it a little bit, but we're going to talk about the things that tend to affect smaller general aviation single engine aircraft and hit upon some of those things like what may be STCs, modifications, a little bit of differences between experimental and standard airworthiness criteria, and also some things, what effect does banner towing or maybe even glider towing that I deal with occasionally have on your performance. So you've probably heard of VY, VX before. And if we take a look at FAR Part 1 and also the Airplane Flying Handbook, which was just recently updated, here's what we have as the definitions for VX. VX is the best angle of climb speed. I'll be using the little toy airplane a few times this evening, but we're talking about the angle, how steep that angle of climb is. And then VY means the speed for best rate. That is the most gain in altitude that you have over the shortest period of time. And, we end up dealing with this, and this applies when we end up going through certification as pilots. We end up dealing with it when we go through refreshers, flight reviews, wings program, things like that, flying with instructors. And you'll even see, you take a look at some of our material and you look at a picture like this that we have in the Airplane Flying Handbook. And I start to point out and ask people, is this really, what is correct? Do you really rotate your aircraft at VX? Do you really climb your aircraft at VX, clearing trees? And do you really climb at VY after the fact? And what effect does your gear and flaps have on that? So think about it. Does this match what you see in your manual? Does your performance match what you see in your aircraft manual? And does it match even the airman certification standards or the practical test standards for this maneuver? I'm going to pull up the private pilot ones, just a couple little segments of it that are current out there. And we'll look at the short field takeoff. And tonight, what we will be covering is items that are associated with this and help you with your knowledge. We're going to talk about atmospheric conditions. including the wind on your takeoff and climb performance. We're definitely going to be talking about VX and VY, and we're going to spend a lot of time in this 1 hour talking about appropriate airplane configuration. And you look at this diagram that we just had taken a look at before and note it, and then let's look at the PTS and what it has for a skill with it. And you'll notice what it ends up talking about is lifts off at the recommended airspeed and accelerates to the recommended obstacle clearance airspeed. Now, is your rotation speed VX in your aircraft? Probably not. It's probably some lower speed. Is your recommended obstacle clearance speed VX? Probably not. It's probably a little bit lower. And we're going to find out why that is the case. Maintain the recommended obstacle clearance speed, or VX in the absence of one, is what the intention of that is. And if you dig deeper into the ACS, you will find that it has that. And then also, these are the other steps that are involved. Ultimately, you will accelerate to VY, which we'll talk about, and that's after clearing the obstacle or the 50 feet AGL, which we'll put a little bit of emphasis there too, because that's for standard certification of aircraft, not necessarily, for extended climbs. And then what is the manufacturer's guidance? So you'll see even some things. I'll use a few different examples, and a lot of GA aircraft have little notes like these in them. This is for the PA-28 Arrow 201, not the one with the Hershey bar wing, 200 horsepower with the tapered wing to it. And it has a few different speeds listed for VY, best rate of climb. 90 knots, gear up, flaps up in the clean configuration, gear down, but flaps up 78. And then also has best angle 78, clean configuration 72 there. But here's some good notes, is performance for a specific airplane may vary from the published figures depending upon. And that is something you want to be thinking about when you're flying your aircraft. Do you have modifications to it? Do you have STCs? Do you have flap gap seals on it? Do you have wheel pants or not? Do you have, VGs on the wings? All of those things that you might have available to you for STCs. Does that impact the speed appropriate? And are you flying it by yourself or fully loaded with the whole family? In fact, the PA-28 is interesting because you start taking a look at short field, and nowhere does it talk about best rate or best angle, especially with the flaps down. Yet when you go to do the short field takeoff, it tells you to have the flaps at 25 degrees. What is the second notch? And if you look, the speeds that it tells you in the guidance, and we'll look at the diagram here, are much, much slower on the initial part of the climb to clear an obstacle than they are in the normal VY, VX that we end up looking at. And you see this if you even look at the chart. The Pipers have the classic kind of runaround chart versus a tabular data, but you can see the liftoff speeds up here and the speeds to clear a 50-foot obstacle. And these are all fairly low. Remember, we looked at VX with the gear down, but flaps up at 72 knots. And at the high end, they're saying to lift off at 59 and climb out over an obstacle at 62. And why is that? Is we're still in the initial acceleration portion of the climb when we're clearing a 50-foot obstacle. And we're going to take a look also at some of the other factors associated with it. Now, I also bring this up because this is always interesting to me, because people start thinking about it and say, wow, maybe things change a little bit. And then there's other pilots that don't necessarily get it. And I bring this up with the Pipers, is if you do a soft field or short field takeoff, as we just noted in the Arrow, It has you do it with 25 degrees of flaps. And I end up watching at different airports around the country, been doing it for years. Watch what I kind of call the Piper worm burner as they go down the runway with 25 degrees of flaps, trying to accelerate either to the published VX or the published VY airspeed. In the Piper Warriors and similar aircraft, you'll see it, fixed gear, but 25 degrees of flaps down, and people try to accelerate to the 79 knot VY speed in ground effect and end up using 4,000 feet of runway. Has turned into many times people doing that into a bad day like this. And it's probably more interesting, it's what we want you to be thinking about tonight, is when you're close to the ground, it can be bad for the airframe. If you've gained altitude and not doing it appropriately, it can not only be bad for the airframe, it can be bad for you, the pilot, and your passengers. So there are some things certification-wise to think about. You would think, oh yeah, the FAA says you have to have, VX, VY published. And more so what have been interested in over the years is the performance to clear that 50-foot obstacle. That's a good set criteria that we end up using. We do actually have and have had requirements for VX, VY to be published in it, but most of our focus is on the takeoff performance data and the climb data with it. And, if you're involved in the testing and new aircraft, there's all sorts of regulations associated with it. And most of what we deal with is I'm going back to the prior to 2017 version of Part 23 for small aircraft. We did change that regulation dramatically in 2017. However, a lot of what we had in there as requirements is still within our guidance or within ASTM, such as for light sport aircraft, things like that. And, when you take a look at climb criteria, out of ground effect, okay, that makes sense. Almost always at maximum takeoff weight. Climb performance, they want to have determined from sea level up to 10,000 feet. And actually, many years ago, there was a time frame where some certificated aircraft that were over 6,000 pounds were required to have recommended climb speeds placarded and VX placarded in the aircraft. That got pulled back after a while. Probably more importantly, what we use to frame that criteria is power plant cooling. And how important that is some of the criteria there has to be done with the minimum fuel grade for the approved engine. Whatever you're going to have for approval in it. Can't do it with your special fuel, I guess. Has to be at least determined for 100 degrees Fahrenheit at sea level. Well, some of us end up flying in conditions a little bit warmer than that from time to time. For power plant cooling, none of the criteria can be done at a speed greater than VY that has been determined by the manufacturer. But you know what, if you're operating cold areas like we do here in New England, they basically say, yeah, if you're talking about winter plates on aircraft cooling in the climb, it's really up to the manufacturer, what temperature, all of that. And then we talk about the engine power, and this is where it kind of catches a lot of people initially, is for determining appropriate power plant cooling for climbs, all they require is 1 minute of takeoff power. And if you have an aircraft that has an approved takeoff power setting, you probably recognize that the manufacturer will tell you, yeah, you have 5 minutes that you can run that. Some aircraft I see 10, but 5 minutes is probably the most common. However, in the cooling test, all they have to do is show it for 1 minute versus the 5. That's it. And then they only have to do it for a continuous 5 minutes climb after that. And you start thinking about it as how often do you only have a 5 minute climb, especially if you're going up to altitude to cruise on a cross country somewhere. They do have some criteria, can't be on the lower end, so 1.2 times VS1. That's stall speed in a specified configuration. Usually is clean with a gear down, forward CG, stuff like that. And that same thing for the to clear a 50-foot obstacle on the initial part of the climb, can't have a speed lower than that. When we start talking about speeds to clear an obstacle. And also, here's one of the things that is a little bit of a gotcha, and it's where you see kind of the big differences between experimental aircraft and standard aircraft. And I have a picture, of a STOL performance aircraft in a very steep climb. Is they also state that it has to be done at a safe enough airspeed, considering the turbulence that can occur at the ground. And also, if a complete and sudden engine failure were to occur in the initial portion of the climb. Now, you take a look at a STOL high performance climb aircraft like this, that's climbing at a very, very steep angle and is at a low altitude. What could be the results if you had an engine failure at low altitude climbing over a 50-foot obstacle? Is it could be pretty tragic very quickly. It's a very draggy aircraft. It will slow down very quickly. You're already at a very high pitch attitude. And with this, I bring forward something to think about for the flight instructors and even for yourself when you're out there training. Is we don't necessarily look at stalls in a very aggravated sense in most of the training that we're doing. Most of the stalls that you do in your private pilot training, and even most of them in your commercial pilot training, are going to be close to the 1 knot per second deceleration, unless you're doing an accelerated stall or something like an elevator trim stall in your CFI training. And this is one of the things to point out is it's not necessarily a 1-to-1 ratio, but it is directly proportional. Is without power, the amount of nose down that you're required to put in on a stall recovery is proportional to the amount that the nose is up above the horizon. Is your only accelerating factor there is gravity, acceleration towards the earth. So I would encourage people, if you haven't seen it before, we've done it a few times in the past, and I think it's on the Boston FAASTeam YouTube channel, talking about stalls and the elevator trim stall, specialty stalls, as some people may end up calling it. But if you're an instructor out there and you're in an aircraft that's capable of doing it, I have to emphasize it because it may be a whip stall or a dynamic stall that some aircraft are not approved for. But have you ever gone out and taken a look at the circumstance, not only an engine failure on normal climb out, but have you gone up at altitude and done a simulated engine failure as if you were doing a short field takeoff? Have you ever gone out and done a full power climb at VX and done a simulated engine failure there? Have you ever done a power on stall with, just as the stall occurs, done a simulated engine failure there, and what you need to recover from it? Those are the type of things that you really can learn a lot about, and it can help you think about your takeoff planning that you end up doing, and also get you thinking about the differences you might see if you're out there flying an experimental aircraft, such as we have here in this picture, versus a standard airworthiness aircraft. So a few other things associated with certification is applicants may vary the climb speeds to meet the requirements for cooling, is what it basically comes down to. You can have full mixture, what the manufacturer can set what you want for the cowl flaps, of course, that's almost always set open. And then also when they do the certification for climbing, they have to do it at most unfavorable weight and CG. Most unfavorable weight is almost always 99.99999% of the time maximum weight, of course. And usually the forward CG is the most critical for climb performance. And if you go back to your basic aerodynamics with your forward CG, you may remember that with a forward CG, you need a little bit more tail down force, which basically is the equivalent of having a little bit more weight acting downwards, which in turn ends up, you have to create a little bit more lift to counteract that. As a result, you end up with a little bit higher airspeed. And you probably can go take a look in your manuals for your aircraft and find that out. Now, I go through all this, and a popular trainer is out there that, believe it or not, the manufacturer comes right out and basically tells us right in the beginning, which we'll take a look at a little bit later on here. But the Cessna 152, if you take a look in the manual, this is in section 4 of the POH for the Cessna 152s. The manufacturer comes straight out and says, on a short field, 10 degrees of flaps and an obstacle clearance speed of 54 knots indicated should be used. This speed provides the best overall climb speed to clear obstacles when accounting for turbulence often found near the ground. Is one of the challenges or one of the things you may find, and what you see with experimental aircraft, like, I got to go back even further, like this, that have, superb performance in the climb, is they may not have the safety margins that a standard airworthiness aircraft has in relation to speeds during a climb. It may also be that the pilot is operating the aircraft, neglecting those safety margins. It does happen where people will use aircraft and climb at slightly slower speeds than the manufacturer recommends, but when you're doing that, you are taking on a little bit of added risk. And I specifically bring up because over the years I have done, flight testing type stuff in Cessna 152s, and consistently, whether it be in the clean configuration or even more so with the 10 degrees of flaps down, is I've found the best angle of climb to typically be about 5 to 10 knots slower than what's published. But Cessna, taking into account the certification standards and what they are allowed to do within those certification standards, appear, I emphasize here, appear, because all I've seen is just the aircraft I've flown in and, done some data test recording on, appears they recommend a speed that's 5 or 10 knots higher than the actual speed where I have found the best angle of climb to be located at. So if we're taking off, and this applies to the takeoff, but it's really also going to apply to the climb, is there's a lot of different things that affect our takeoff performance. Our rotation speed, the acceleration that we have from the aircraft, how much thrust, that's dependent upon altitude, it's dependent upon the surface of the runway, drag, technique, dragging brakes, even aircraft configuration and condition. Some of you have probably seen, like I've seen occasionally, somebody inadvertently tried taking off in an old Cessna with 40 degrees of flaps, or even a Piper with the 40 degrees of flaps or so down, and don't accelerate well. Aircraft contamination, is there standing water on it? Is there frost on the aircraft? Don't want to be taking off with frost, definitely. Same thing with ice. What is the weight? Air density we talked about, slope, wind. What is important to note is actually in your takeoff performance, the manual for your aircraft rarely accounts for most of these. In fact, you're even going to be lucky if it accounts for some of these. We look back and it's usually old CAR certified aircraft, but there are some out there that all they end up having is just a published takeoff distance standard sea level at max weight, and that's all that they show. Doesn't adjust for, soft field operations, gravel runways, grass runways, snow-covered runways, tall grass, tall wet grass, as other countries may end up doing. So let's put some focus on VX. Is what are the factors that do tend to affect VX when we are climbing? In some aircraft like this old Call Air, used for agricultural operations and occasionally used for towing banners or gliders nowadays, when you can find them still out there. They're good climbing aircraft, not great cruisers, not going to get you very fast from point A to point B, but they do fairly well at climbing. And you'll note a lot of aircraft that do fairly well at climbing don't necessarily work on getting cleaned up. They have struts sticking out and all that, but you will note things like this. And if you compare it to the Sundowner out behind it, very large cowling openings in order to get that cooling air, cowling flaps like you see sticking off the side here, just to get some air to pass through the engine compartment, all of that. And we'll look at detail on these things here, but weight, if we're taking off at less than maximum weight, we're almost always going to see that our VX speed, indicated airspeed, decreases. Also, what we're going to tend to see is an increase, like in this Piper Pawnee, in the angle of our climb. And we're going to take a look at some climb curves later on here to look at that. Configuration, usually what we will end up seeing with flaps down changes the profile of the wing. Usually that will decrease our VX speed some. Usually you'll even see it with the landing gear. The propeller can have an effect on that. You get into aircraft like this Call Air here, Pawnees, things that are associated with agricultural or seaplane operations. That is really a factor too, is there's always the climb props versus the cruise props, what the pitch is on it. Altitude, we'll look at this a little bit later on also, but because really what we're thinking about is we operate in indicated airspeed / calibrated airspeed, but how the aircraft performs really is in the density of the air and the true airspeed. VX, as we gain in altitude, actually gains slightly, increases some, doesn't increase or have, let me rephrase that, does not have as much of a change as VY does with altitude, but it does change some. And how it changes is as you gain in altitude, the indicated airspeed for your VX will increase slightly. And wind, the classic headwind versus a tailwind. This is where we see the greatest change in our angle of climb. We're not going to see a change in the indicated airspeed for VX, but we are going to see significant changes in the angle of climb versus going into a headwind versus no wind versus a tailwind. Is we are still climbing through a parcel of air at the same angle, just the wind and the air parcel moving with it affects our relationship to items on the ground. And this is why, part of the reason why you really don't ever want to take off with a tailwind, if at all possible. So as we mentioned, it is the angle of climb. It's the most altitude per unit of distance as we measure it over the ground. When we talk about it as an indicated airspeed, actually what's happening is we're measuring that distance through the partial of air. Hopefully it's calm wind conditions with it. We'll look at some data here that will show you. It is the speed that you're going to want to use when you're trying to clear obstacles under most circumstances. So, let's just say you're in the valley of the mountains and need to climb up, or maybe you need to climb up through that classic sucker hole that exists in the clouds because you want to get up in the beautiful blue sky that's up above it. Is VX probably is the best airspeed to use when you're doing that. How can we measure it? It is the greatest gap between what is our thrust available and thrust required. We're going to see that here on some charts in just a few minutes. And where it ends up occurring is very near L over D max for a jet aircraft and is below L over D max for a propeller driven aircraft, piston engine, turboprop. It's pretty darn close to minimum sink. Now, if you're not familiar with those speeds, could recommend, I think, John, we had gone through it back a while ago, but there is an online course. I think you also can find it on the Boston FAASTeam YouTube channel, but talking about gliding for the airplane pilot and get you to know those criteria, L over D max and minimum sink. Guess what? We looked at those in terms of descent performance in that course, but now those same speeds pop back up when we're talking about our climb performance in the aircraft. So what we are focusing on in VX is we're looking at the climb angle that is right down here. And an ideal world would be something close to what you see here. It looks like an RV to me, RV2 or RV4, excuse me, probably. But, the ideal VX climb would be if you had enough thrust available that you could climb straight vertically without slowing down and even had the capability to accelerate. But the big difference that adjusts what that angle of climb is here is dependent upon what your excess thrust is. Now, this is a little bit different. This picture probably, I suspect, is taken from a circumstance of what many people would call a zoom climb, is the aircraft just accelerated and pitched up to a very steep angle because it had a whole lot of excess energy and is starting to lose and cannot maintain a steady state climb at this angle. And you will find also that this is not a good way to go about doing initial climbs if you have an obstacle to clear, because you will end up using much more length of the runway or distance clearing that obstacle and doing something like this. But for aerobatic performances, it looks pretty darn neat. So if we take a look at it, here is what we're going to use to kind of reference. Now, this is not engineering. This is just simple practical application where we're going to take a look at some details on this. Where VX ends up occurring for us is wherever we have the largest gap between what is our thrust required and our thrust available on the aircraft. This is for a propeller-driven aircraft where at very low speeds, we'll get the most thrust out of the propeller. We could probably adjust this some if we had a fixed pitch propeller. This might, let's just say this was for a climb propeller. With a cruise propeller, we might end up with a curve, that looks a little bit more like that with it. We also could adjust the amount of thrust required, which is the same thing as drag, basically, because this curve is developed off of our total of induced drag, which looks similar to that, and our sum of parasite drag that has a curve that looks similar to that. You may remember that diagram where you have total drag and it has the curve of induced drag and the curve of parasite drag with it. That's where this curve comes from. And of course, down here at the bottom is our stall speed. That's as slow as we can fly in unaccelerated flight. we have this whole speed regime from here to here that we fly in, and this ends up being our maximum level flight airspeed. Now, a jet-driven aircraft, a jet air powered engine, power plant, produces near a level thrust setting. Not entirely true, but when you look at documents that talk about it for a basic understanding, like this diagram here, I believe is out of Aerodynamic for Naval Aviators. You'll see it in other books like Flight Dynamics for Pilots and all of that. The Aerodynamics for Naval Aviators is available right on FAA.gov. Is the thrust available there is going to be a fairly flat curve. So as a result, the greatest difference between the thrust available and the thrust required is going to be right in this position where we see the lowest point on our thrust required curve. And you can even look at Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge. We talk about this too. We give examples, a little bit better color diagram with it. You know, we talked about L/D max is down here at the bottom of the thrust required or the drag curve in relation to it. Stall is here. This is the jet engine example, you know, where you get the maximum angle of climb at the greatest excess thrust. And for a propeller driven aircraft, you end up seeing it here. So let's take a look. I'm going to draw on this diagram here on a few different things, but let's look at what factors end up having an impact on it. Let's just say instead of flying at maximum weight, we flew at lesser weight, you know, almost near minimum weight. Just you yourself in your aircraft, along with, say, half fuel or something like that. What you're going to end up seeing is actually probably, and I'm going to change what I'm writing with here. Give me just 1 second. I apologize. Hopefully I can do this. But our stall speed is going to end up decreasing. It's going to go a little bit slower in relation to it. We're probably also going to end up, because we're at lighter weights, being in a position where our maximum speed is going to be greater. And because of that decreased weight, we're not going to need quite as much lift. We're not going to probably produce quite as much induced drag, as we would see a curve that would follow along like this, would probably be fairly equal down near the bottom, and then slowly creep back in to the prior curve that we end up seeing with it. So we end up in this circumstance at the decreased weight is we have better performance around the aircraft, and we'll even end up with better angle of climb. But you'll notice, because the difference is larger over on this side of the curve versus this one, and there's also some of the curvature up there, are now our largest gap in total energy. Can't draw straight here, can I, folks? I've got to learn to draw with the mouse. Will end up being a little bit slower airspeed. Let's take a look at the next factor on it. We talked a little bit about propeller, constant speed propeller, which will flatten out this curve, which this probably is for, I would assume, compared to what I typically see whenever these are plotted out on various aircraft in testing. This is a typical flat curve to it. You know, and a constant speed propeller allows it to be efficient or more efficient over a larger range of airspeeds. If we had a climb propeller on it, I'll make this blue. we probably would see a curve that would look something more like this. And if you've ever flown an airplane with either a cruise prop or a climb prop on it, you'll know, yeah, with a climb prop, you get up and go climbing fairly fast and do well at climbing up, a good angle and everything, but your top speed performance is limited because of usually limitations on the engine, because with the climb propeller, you're probably going to end up overspeeding the engine. And then if we look at a cruise propeller, what we would typically see is more of a curve like this. So what we typically would end up finding is in the cruise propeller, a little bit higher VX airspeed, probably even closer to the L over D max, and with the climb propeller, VX that has decreased a little bit in its airspeed. Configuration, the way to think about these curves is always, what does it do to the top end and the low end? And then think about what happens in between. You know, if you're talking just gear, it's probably not going to have much effect on your stall speed. But what happens if you put down flaps? Well, you're going to end up having a lower stall speed with the flaps down. Okay, what happens to your top speed? Well, that's going to end up changing, and it's going to end up being lower with either of those. And think about this, think about it in terms of induced drag, parasite drag. Flaps, for the most part, think of it as giving you more induced drag. Gear, think of it as giving you more parasite drag, right? I'm kind of get them both together, but if I'll go with the color, let's do purple for just the landing gear. What we would tend to see is the curve start something like this, no change in induced drag, really no major change probably in stall speed also with just the landing gear. It would follow the curve down, but as we got down near the bottom and as the parasite drag started to become more prominent, it would curve up something like this, you know, and we probably would not see a whole lot of change, maybe some, but probably would not see a whole lot of change with just the gear. However, if we did it with the flaps, which I'll put here in green, we're going to have a change in our stall speed. That's going to change. And then we're also going to have a significant change. It's going to make this curve probably much steeper. And let me undo that one for a specific reason, because I drew it on the wrong side, because we're going to see increased drag. We're probably going to look at a curve closer to this, which is going to end up lowering our VX speed. Altitude, what we'll see is significant changes in our thrust available. With that, as we gain in altitude, it's going to stay similar, but it's going to decrease like that. And because this change of the curve is steeper than this one, that's where we'll see the small little creeping up in that direction of our VX speed. And you can even think about stall kits. What effect would they end up having? Let me clear all drawings, please. There we go. You know, same thing, we think about flaps or something like that. What we're going to see with a stall kit is lower speed. We're probably going to see greater induced drag with it, even probably greater parasite drag. And we're going to see the thrust required curve change to something like this. And we're going to end up with VX, probably a slightly less rate of climb, but not as significant because it's near the same as original down here, but at a slightly lower airspeed. that ends up occurring at. And then bush wheels, we talked about gear already, but along the same lines, you put really big fat tires on your airplane, pretty neat, get you over the rocks, but that has a huge impact on your top end airspeed. Very little impact, if any, on your stall speed, but you're going to end up with a, top speed probably somewhere down here in relation to it. And those are big time parasite dragged ears. You're going to look at something like this down here at your lower end. It's not going to be as significant impact on your angle of climb, but it will end up probably changing your top end speed quite a bit, and it probably will shift it a little bit slower speed in relation to it. So you go back to that stall experimental aircraft we had in the picture earlier, climbing at the really, really steep angle, big fat tires on it and everything. Yeah, does great at the low end airspeed, in terms of angle of climb and everything, but you try to go fast in it, it's just not going to happen. So was mentioning this. Oh, let me clear out all the drawings. Excellent. There we go. Short field technique. You start thinking about it. People ask, if I'm going to take off on a short field and I get to climb at VX, are flaps going to help me or hurt me? Well, that really does depend upon the aircraft that you're using. It really is a balance between how much shorter your takeoff roll is, how quick you get up off of the runway, as you're cruising along, get up and accelerate without the drag of the runway, versus what the angle is that you're able to climb at. Many times what you will find, because it involves an acceleration, it almost always is recommended by most manufacturers for clearing the 50-foot obstacle. If you measure way out in the long run, it may not have the best benefit for you, such as if you had to do a best angle of climb for 1,000 feet of altitude and whatever distance that may end up being. And you'll see notes, these are the little gems that are hidden in the approved flight manuals. And this is for the Cessna 172, is the use of 10 degrees of flaps will shorten it by about 10%. But guess what? You lose this advantage in the climb to the 54. So they say only use the 10 degrees of flaps for minimum ground runs or takeoff from soft or rough fields. If you really have to get it off of the ground. But if you're going to end up clearing obstacles, it's probably not going to help you, and you have to weigh that out as a pilot, And in the PA-28R, I was using that as an example, just one of the aircraft I grabbed to use, is they end up recommending it. Why? With 20 degrees of flaps, you're going to get off the ground so much quicker than without the flaps, that clearing a 50-foot obstacle, it will completely shorten your distance. Just like we looked at with the flaps, you're not going to have as good of an angle of climb with the flaps down at 25 versus 0 degrees of flaps. But you're going to end up in a situation where you've shortened the ground roll so much that it's going to make up for it. Let's talk a little bit about factors affecting VY. You look at this picture and you start thinking, oh, I think that could affect VY, my best rate of climb. And we'll look at some of the things here again quickly with formula and the curves, but basically, higher weight, maximum weight is your highest VY. You decrease the weight, the VY speed is going to decrease. Flapping gear usually end up reducing VY. We'll talk about that a little bit. Soft field takeoff. We'll talk a little bit about altitude, that the indicated airspeed for VY decreases with altitude. And this decreases at a rate greater than VX increases. VX increases slowly as you gain in altitude, the indicated airspeed for it, say from 50 to 54 knots at maximum altitude, where your VY will decrease at a greater rate. And instead of only being a 4-knot span, maybe a 10-knot span. It may go, say, from 70 to 60 knots or whatever. And that's partly because as we look at it, and again, looking at true airspeed measurements, is the power required curve as we gain in altitude will end up moving up what's called the tangent. And then other things, I had to put this one in there. I've been an instructor for a long, long time. I've done the right rudder, right rudder, right rudder. Or if you fly some aircraft with engines from Great Britain or others, maybe you need left rudder. But, we have these little things, I think my right foot got in the habit of tapping all the time on climb over the years. And even other things. We'll look at VY specifically with icing conditions. Didn't look at it with VX because actually you're probably much closer to the stall. But if you're out there instrument flying and have an aircraft approved for flight in known icing conditions, you probably have recognized there's significant changes in the speeds if you're flying in icing conditions. And we'll take a look at why that is. Now, you probably already heard from me a little bit of a precursor is unlike thrust required and thrust available, VY is based upon the amount of power available. Piston powered engines do a terrific job at producing power, i.e. a lot of torque. And oh boy, the, diesel engines are terrific at this too. They get up and go. I used to teach in a DA-42 and it always amazed me at how great they were at the low end to just get up and go because they had so much power and torque available to them. We'll take a look at this a little bit with the curves and rate of climb chart. As we mentioned earlier by the part 1 definition, what we also see in the airplane flying handbook, VY is the most altitude per unit of time, not by unit of distance. It's best used in gaining altitude, of course. You want to get as high as you can, as quickly as you can. That's something to recognize is if you're doing a high altitude climb, you're probably going to need to go a little bit slower. It is interesting. You can play a few little games with this by using the rate of climb formula, which is basically the difference between the power available, power required, multiplied 33,000 divided by weight. And where this occurs is L over D max for a jet and above L over D max for a jet, excuse me. It's actually very close to the square root of L over D max. It occurs very close to L over D max for a prop. Some very minor differences. You'll see most places actually say it occurs at L over D max for a propeller. And here's diagram out of, I believe, the aerodynamics for naval aviators, which shows you shows you power required curve, just like before, is at the bottom. Here's your stall speed. At the top ends is your maximum level flight speeds. Here's an example of what a power available curve would look like for propeller driven aircraft. And as you take a look in most FAA things, there are small differences here, some curvature to it, but most of what you end up seeing from us will just show it as a straight line on jet powered aircraft. And where you end up with the highest rate of climb, your VY occurs where you have the greatest difference between those. And if you want to figure out your rate of climb, feet per minute, there's a formula for you right there using English units. In the FAA handbook, something very similar. You'll see the L over D max shown on these. with a maximum rate of climb for a propeller-driven aircraft is occurring there, but it's up above that for turbine-powered aircraft. Let's look at some of the factors here. Weight we had talked about before, the same type of thing. And what we can do is, again, because usually in manufacturing certification, it's done at maximum weight, but what would happen if you reduce the weight? Well, you'd end up out here at a slower airspeed. Each little point, you need less power required, and you also would end up at where it crossed at some higher point. So the curve would move down, kind of flatten out a little bit also in relation to it. So what you would end up finding with that flattening out of the curve is that your VY speed would end up decreasing slightly with a decrease in the weight. Towing, hey, that's kind of like increasing some weight, you know, put a banner on the back or a heavy glider, you know, you see some big things there. You know, your power available is going to stay about the same, but boy, you're going to have significant changes in your power required. You know, in terms of stall, it's going to be pretty darn close. Hate to say, I actually haven't purposely done that, gone out and stalled while towing a banner or a glider, and I don't intend to either. But it's going to be pretty darn close, if not the same, but it's going to require a lot more power to it. And you're also going to end up in the circumstance where your maximum level speed is going to be much lower, and you're going to have a lot more power required. And just similar, I won't say exactly the same because there are some factors involved in it, but similar to the thrust required curve, we're going to see probably the increase on this occur more out here at the higher speed, you know, larger gap out in this area. So what you're going to end up having is your maximum rate of climb is going to decrease significantly, but you're probably going to end up in a situation where your VY is also decreasing slightly. Hard to say. I would actually probably have to test that one out a little bit more, but it is going to have significant impact on your ability to climb. That is definitely the case. Configuration, same type of things as we looked at. You know, let's just take flaps into account here. On this one, we won't talk about the gear, but we're going to stall at a slightly lower speed with the flaps down, depending upon what type of flaps, how well they are, size, all of that will have an impact on your aircraft. You're going to have more induced drag on it. And you're also going to have a much slower level flight speed. So you're going to end up with a rate of climb that's going to be a bit less, and the speed at which VY occurs once you start putting down the flaps decreases. Altitude we mentioned, but this is one where it probably has a lot of effect on the power available. Your power required curve is going to shift up this tangent slightly, but it's going to do it at a fairly slow rate in comparison to your power available curve, which is going to decrease significantly. So you end up with a much lower rate of climb. We've all seen that in aircraft, and end up with that being at a lower rate. Stall kit, you know, let you think about that one just for timing, but we're going to end up slower speed, slower here, probably a little bit more drag, but greater difference. So we'll end up with a slower speed there. I do want to get to bush wheels. We talked about that. Same type of thing. We're going to see something similar in the power required curve to what we saw in the power available curve. But where I really do want to bring up is, let's think about the icing conditions, such as that 172 I showed you earlier. And this is where, you know, you get the whammy effect. This is why you want to be careful out there. First thing to think about is what happens to power available. Well, guess what? Your propeller efficiency with ice on the propeller is going to go down, even if you have a de-ice propeller with electric heating boots on it. And probably the same if you have an electric, or not an electric, but a alcohol de-ice propeller, is you're going to have some remnants, things sticking on it, all of that. It's not going to work anywhere near as well. So one, you're going to end up in this situation where your power available curve has decreased significantly. So already you're ending up with a much reduced rate of climb. Then if we start taking a look at, well, happens to power required? Well, you take a look at all of that ice hanging on the wings, the tails, all of that, your stall speed's going to decrease. That one doesn't show as well. Let's change colors. Your stall speed's going to increase significantly. And then there's so much drag, your top end speed is going to decrease significantly. And then also, it's not anywhere near as significant, but you get a tremendous amount of drag associated with all of that, which is slowing you down. And you also have some added weight with that. You end up in this circumstance where you end up with very little in terms of rate of climb. In fact, you may even end up with something that looks more like this, where you've seen this before. When you get into this area right here, the person is unable to maintain altitude. All they can do to keep flying is just descend. That's happened to us. We've seen a lot of icing accidents over the years, then led to stalls in relation to it. And it's hard to say on what's going to happen to your VY. It's probably going to end up going up some, but the rate of climb is just going to really shrink down to almost nothing very quick. You know, it's one of those things, it's the whammy all the way around on you. So you want to be careful about that. Now, we talked about wind, and because we look at VY, we're not overly concerned with the wind in terms of what our rate of climb is on this, but it does have a big impact on our angle of climb, our VX speed. Is if we end up having a headwind, which is useful and beneficial, we could end up at an angle a little bit more like that, make it easier to clear the obstacles. However, you also do need to take into account and think about, you know, if you're climbing at an angle like that, that the more wind, the more likely the circumstances are for turbulence, especially near the ground, whether that be rotor from it hitting trees, buildings, whatever else it may be around there. Also, if you're in mountainous areas, such as, you know, fly around a lot in, you could end up in circumstances, maybe you're lucky that, you know, you have some orographic lifting, but it's more likely near the airport that you're not going to, and you're going to have some suppression or lack of convergence, which brings you down. And then even worse case is if you take off with a tailwind, you end up with a shallower angle of climb on both VY, VX, but VX where you're concerned about, you know, the obstacles that are out there. You know, that wonderful pine tree here in New England that's about 100 feet tall in off the end of the runway. You know, we've all seen those before. That's what you need to be concerned with. You also want to be concerned with the effect and use of controls. Rarely do we have circumstances of a direct headwind or even a direct tailwind. And you got to think about making up for, say, that 10 knots of wind on the effectiveness of your controls. Is if you're taking off in a 10 knot headwind, it's like you got 10 knots already going over the controls. To get that airflow of 10 knots in a 10 knot tailwind, you got to already be up to 20 knots. Now, if you have something that has very good directional control, such as a nose wheel airplane, maybe not as big of a deal. But if you're flying a type of aircraft that doesn't have as good of directional control, such as a trike, carousel with weight shift control or powered parachute especially, and we even deal with it, you probably recognize or know I fly gliders, the effectiveness of your controls on a downwind takeoff can be very detrimental. And that increases the ground roll. We looked at the rate of climb and angle of climb with the increased weight of towing a banner or a glider. You're building upon one thing after another, after another, after another. Now, it is possible you can do this. This is an example. This was back years ago in Bonanza 836. Let me clear out the drawing so you're not seeing that. Excellent. It is possible you can go out and start to cross-reference and figure out at altitude what your rate of climb is in various configurations. Let me clear that. Figure that out and plot it and start to get a whole bunch of plots at, say, every 5 or 10 knots, climb for a 400, 500 foot spell to let it stabilize, see what your rate of climb is. With GPS now, that it's even added benefit, much better than reading it off of, an old archaic VSI. And you can start to plot this out, and you can start to figure out at given altitude, given weight, given conditions, what your rate of climb is, and VY will be at the maximum point of this. And VX actually, when you do this, ends up being the tangent from the zero plot. So you end up finding that. And in our aircraft certification, that's actually even what we recommend to manufacturers, is I'll show you here in a little bit, is for them to go out and get a bunch of this test data. And if you've got a new home-built experimental, this is how you figure out VY, VX in it. You go out, get a bunch of data and start taking a look at that, and then extrapolate that data. And you can do it for all these different conditions. Like this is a older Beechcraft Bonanza 836 with the shorter wings, but flaps 10 degrees. You'll notice, the rate of maximum rates of climb change from like 900 feet per minute or so in this plot down to a kind of consistent 725, it looks like. And then you start putting down full flaps and landing gear, how much it decreases. And this gives you some idea to think about what would your rate of climb be on a balked landing if you ended up having that. And here's an example from our advisory circular 23-8, which talks about flight certification testing for aircraft, where they say, at different altitudes, start plotting this out, and you'll end up over time developing a good idea of what VY is at different altitudes. And you'll notice it's higher altitudes are up at the top, or excuse me, lower altitudes up at the top, higher altitudes are closer down here. The rate of climb is decreased with it. But you'll see as VY, as you increase in altitude, actually ends up getting to be a lower airspeed, and VX, the tangent point on these curves, ends up getting to be slightly higher. And you can even figure out altitudes quickly if you want to, where you have your service ceiling, 100 feet per minute climb, 50 feet for one engine inoperative. Also interesting to note on these gives you an idea just to think about how your angle of climb, VX speeds, change as you get higher in altitude. You notice that they get shallower with the higher altitudes. And we've just hit upon a few different things here tonight. There's just so many factors that come into play on it. But, hopefully what you've gotten out of tonight, here's just a few things to be thinking about, kind of review-wise. Can you answer these questions? Can you describe the difference between VX, VY? Best rate of climb, best angle of climb, what that is. What's VX and VY for your aircraft at maximum weight, standard sea level conditions? What is it at maximum weight and at, say, 10,000 feet? The American Bonanza Society has a kind of quick quiz reference thing to look up these type of figures and even make some of these calculations for their members. A terrific way to help you understand your aircraft a little bit better. What happens to indicated VY as you gain altitude? Remember that it decreases slowly. VX will increase slowly, but nowhere near the same rate. VX will probably only go up a couple knots. VY is going to decrease probably 5-6 knots in most small general aviation aircraft. What effect does it have on indicated airspeeds, flaps have on VX, VY? What impact does it have on the angle of climb? We talked about that in the beginning, and on your rate of climb. What effect does a headwind have on your angle of climb? Greatly increases it. Rate of climb, no difference. We're paying attention over time, not necessarily the obstacle, but you're going to focus on the angle of climb if you have to clear an obstacle. In almost all small general aviation aircraft, the speed to clear a 50-foot obstacle is usually published at less than VX. Why? Is it because of configuration? Is it because of acceleration factors? How does that apply to your aircraft? What happens to your climb speeds if you're towing a banner or a glider? What happens to your performance in terms of climb? What happens if you end up going out and getting all those neat STCs, the slats, the stole cuff, the extended wingtips? We didn't talk about that, but what happens when you make your wing much larger and you can now fly at a much slower airspeed? Your stall speed decreases significantly. What happens to your cruise speed? And think about what happens there with either the thrust required in the case of angle of climb or the power required. So those are just some of the things that I hope tonight got you thinking about. And I hope those are the type of things that you can sit down and start to figure about the type of aircraft you fly or your own aircraft with it. Do want to thank you for joining us tonight. With the Wings program, our big thing is we want you to be a proficient pilot. So fly regularly with your CFI, work on practice and making that practice perfect, and get involved in annual checking. We have the Wings program. If you're not part of a program that does annual checking, it'll help you out much better than just trying to do the flight review every 2 years. Take a look at the FAA Wings program, and do want to thank you for joining us tonight, because you are a part of what helps keep aviation safe. Participating in things like this, we know that you want more education, which is absolutely wonderful. We're going to go ahead and close it out. I'll stay on along with the rest of us for a little bit of an opportunity to answer some questions, but you don't have to stay on for that. So do